video. If you're new here, my name is Haley, and if you're not new, thank you so much for coming back to join me today. Today we are going to go over all of the books that I read in January, and if I say so myself, I do think the other 11 months this year are going to have some pretty big shoes to fill. So let's go ahead and get straight into it. At the beginning of the month, I did set a TBR with 9 books on it, and I used a random number generator to choose those 9 books off of my TBR cart. So we'll start by talking about the books that I read from that TBR. So I read 7 out of 9 of those books, which I think is pretty good. I did read more than that overall for the month as a whole, but getting to at least 7 of those 9 feels pretty good for me. Obviously, I would have liked to have gotten to all 9 of them, but that's okay. I'll just be putting those 2 leftover books back on the cart so that they could potentially be chosen in a future video. So let's go over the 7 that I did read, and these are not going to be in any particular order. So the first one that I read off of my physical TBR was Magnolia Parks, and I personally really enjoyed this. I really liked Jessa Hastings' writing throughout, and the ways that she chose to describe different feelings and sensations were really unique. And while I do feel like, it might become over the top or I might get tired of it as I do continue to read this series as my first novel by her, I really enjoyed that. And I really liked Magnolia's character. I definitely think, as I anticipated, this book is extremely toxic and the relationships that are presented in the book are extremely toxic, but I honestly really enjoyed some of the drama. I mean, personally, I was a fan of reality TV shows like Jersey Shore, so this kind of falls into that, and I always enjoy reading books or watching shows that have that air of like rich people who are kind of unconnected and the problems that are world shattering to them are so different compared to people who are not in their financial bracket. So I really enjoyed Magnolia Parks overall. I feel like enjoyed is a hard word because there's a lot of like gritty, painful stuff in this book, but I really enjoyed reading it, and I am looking forward to reading Daisy Hates in February. Now, the second book on my stack is Elsewhere by Gabrielle Zevin. Oh, I forgot to mention what I rated Magnolia Parks. Let me find that for you really quick. I rated Magnolia Parks 4.25 stars, so pretty high rating for me. All right, so as I was saying, Elsewhere is the next book that I have on my list from those that I finished from my physical TBR. And this is the third Gabrielle Zevin book that I've read. I've also read Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, which was one of my all-time favorite books. The year that I read that, it was definitely one of my top books of that year, and it's something that I think about often. And I also listened to the audiobook for The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry last year, which I enjoyed, but I do think I would have enjoyed more if I physically read it. And then I had this book. So I think this is honestly a case of poor timing for me. Um, this is not a spoiler because it tells you right here in the little blurb on the back of the book that you're following a teenager who has passed away and you're seeing her in the afterlife and kind of exploring what that means and what happens to her. Unfortunately, the way that the main character passed away is the way that someone that I personally knew passed away less than 6 months ago. So for me, getting through the first couple chapters of this book was pretty triggering. I almost didn't continue with the book, but I wanted to believe that that subject wasn't going to continue to be at the forefront or described in more detail throughout the book, so I did push through. Honestly, I think the book was fine. It was pretty predictable where things would go. But I think as a young adult novel, this is a good look at grief and kind of considering what happens when we die and how people's lives are affected when you die. I don't know. I just thought it was kind of an interesting book. But for me, overall, I just think it was not necessarily great timing. So I did give this a 3-star rating. The next book I have that I finished is Wrong Place, Wrong Time. And this is a thriller, murder, mystery kind of book that was really interesting. A friend of mine had pointed this out to me as one that she had been recommended, and I had picked it up. And I really like getting a thriller book. I like it when I need a little break because they tend to be very fast paced. Unfortunately, I didn't find the pacing in this one to be as fast or as fast as I would have liked it to be. The concept in this book is really interesting. It's not exactly Groundhog Day, so our main character is not waking up on the same day over and over, but every day, instead of moving forward to tomorrow, she wakes up yesterday. So she's going back in time, and she has some time skips as she tries to unravel what has caused the event at the beginning of the book to take place to potentially try to stop it. So I really liked that concept. I just don't think the execution was my favorite because I had figured out all of the twist and where the story was headed long before the main character figured it out, and I was getting to the point of feeling like, okay, this is going on a little too long. We don't need to continue to backtrack. Our main character should know what has happened by now because she's intelligent. So I did give this 3.5 stars because it was an enjoyable read and I really like the concept, but I wish it had had me a little bit more on the edge of my seat. The next book that I finished was actually the last book that I finished for the month, and that was Anatomy, a Love Story. And this is a young adult novel that I think is pretty unique. I would say it's more of a darker love story, and I actually really enjoyed this. This was definitely a last ditch attempt to try to get one more book off of my physical TBR for the month because I finished Wrong Place, Wrong Time in the morning on January 31st, and then I picked this up and read it in its entirety before the end of the day. So, obviously, it had pretty good pacing for me to be able to stay interested and continue to read it. And I really like the characters in this book. Our main character really wants to be a physician, but this is set in older times in Scotland, I believe. And all the presents, like all the men in her life are obviously telling her she can't be a physician, that like it's cute that she wants to pretend to be a physician. Her mother is urging her to get married and secure her place in society, but she is determined to study anatomy and become a physician. And I just felt that this was really, really interesting overall. There's also a little bit of a mystery going on, and there is a small, very sweet romance going on throughout the book as well. And I rated this one 4.25 stars. One of the first books that I finished from my TBR this month was Dragonfall by L.R. Lamb, and I really honestly enjoyed this book. I picked it up in my reading the highest and lowest rated books in my physical TBR video at the beginning of the month, so if you haven't watched that, I will link it so you can go and watch it if you want to hear more in-depth thoughts on this. But I really enjoyed this book, and I honestly think the only reason that it had a lower rating was because there's a lot of use of they, them pronouns and gender fluidity in the book. And personally, I have no issue with that, but I do think there are a lot of people that are transphobic who have been review bombing this book. So if you want to hear my full thoughts on everything in the book, I would encourage you to watch that reading vlog. But this is actually really good, and I really enjoyed it, and I would recommend picking it up if you're interested. And the other book that I picked up in that reading vlog was James. This was the highest rated book on my physical TBR, and this did get 5 stars from me. I'm not sure if I mentioned the rating I gave Dragonfall. I gave it 4 stars. This did get 5 stars for me, and I really enjoyed it. I was literally taking pictures of the pages and annotating it on my phone because I didn't want to write in the book, and I was laying down and reading it. But I would highly recommend reading this, whether you have or have not read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I think this is a really wonderful novel. I also read The Wager this month, which was on my physical TBR. I did end up listening to the audiobook for this one just because I wasn't feeling super excited about picking it up and reading it. Some details of the story might have stuck with me a little bit better if I had picked up the physical book. However, I don't think I would have been able to get through it this month if I picked up the physical book just because it's not really, I don't know, I wasn't really in the mood to read this right now. So it wasn't bad, but it wasn't my favorite nonfiction book that I've ever picked up. I do think that it was interesting and the author made some pretty great points towards the end of the book, but it just wasn't my favorite overall. So maybe I'll give this another chance in the future if I ever feel like picking up the physical copy. But I did enjoy it. It just wasn't my absolute favorite that I've ever read. So I did give this one 3.5 stars. And then the two books that I did not get to on my physical TBR were Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was the book that Blade Runner is based off of, and The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. So this one definitely, I think I'm going to revisit closer to the fall. I do also like to do a Summerween week, so I might save this for Summerween. But for some reason, I just wasn't drawn to picking this one up off of the physical TBR that had been selected for me by my random number generator. So definitely headed back to the TBR cart for those two. So as I mentioned, I did read some other books that were not on my physical TBR that I chose in my January TBR video. There is going to be a little bit of a discrepancy between my Fable and Goodreads accounts and my Storygraph account because I started using Storygraph on January 1st and I logged Nettle and Bone as the first book that I had read, although Goodreads and Fable are going to show Nettle and Bone as the last book that I finished for 2024. So I'm not going to talk about Nettle and Bone because I lumped it in with 2024. It just so happened that the day that I started using Storygraph, I put it on there as the first book that I had read because I was trying to learn how to use it. So if you happen to look at my accounts on those, they're not going to necessarily agree, but that's okay with me. Nettle and Bone was a shorter book. I don't think it's going to throw off my stats for the whole year drastically. And I know that my book count on Goodreads and Fable are more accurate than my book count on Storygraph. So the first book that I officially finished in January was The Dragon Republic by R.F. Kuang, and I did listen to this on audiobook. This is the second book in the Poppy War trilogy, and overall I really enjoyed this trilogy as a whole. I did rate The Dragon Republic 4.5 stars, and I do feel like I appreciated the series more with each book that I read further into the series. The second book that I read this month was I Cheerfully Refuse, and this is one that's been on my TBR, and I moved it to the top of my TBR because Plant-Based Bride, or Elizabeth, recently read it in a sci-fi reading vlog where she read the top Goodreads sci-fi choices for 2024, and it was by far the one that she enjoyed the most out of that video, and I've wanted to read it for a long time, so I did move that to the top of my TBR. I do have a physical copy of the book. It's an art copy that I actually got from someone else locally, but I ended up reading this on my Kindle just because I wanted the ebook version, and I ended up enjoying this just as much as Elizabeth did, so this was a 5-star read for me, and I was so excited to be starting off the year with such high ratings, and overall I really, really enjoyed this book, and I would definitely encourage you to read it. The third book that I finished this month was also on Kindle because it's available through Kindle Unlimited, and that was Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. And I picked this one up because I'm actually participating in PewDiePie or Felix Kjellberg's book review book club. I'm not really sure what's happening with it, but he made a long video about it, and I did sign up through the Google form that he gave, and I am planning to read the books that he listed each month this year, so that is why I picked it up, and I actually really enjoyed reading this. I wouldn't say it's in the genre or type of literature that I typically pick up, but that's one thing that I'm really wanting to expand this year and read other genres and types of books that I wouldn't normally necessarily reach for. And I actually found that I related to a lot of the principles that were being depicted throughout the book, and a lot of them actually reminded me of many of the teachings that I learned as I was going through my yoga 200-hour certification, which honestly have really deeply impacted me and the way that I live my life and the way that I aspire to live my life. So I actually really, really enjoyed reading that, and I was glad to have it on my TBR for this month, and I did give it 5 stars, although I find rating this type of book to be a little bit more difficult because it is something that's well renowned, and it's speaking about Taoism, and I don't necessarily feel like it's rated in the same way as I would rate other fiction books, but for me, it was a 5-star read, and I'm really appreciative to have started off my year with that as the first read of the year. Next, I did finish the Poppy War trilogy by listening to The Burning God on audiobook, so that's the third book in the Poppy War trilogy, and this one was a 5-star for me. It was definitely a very painful book to read. It was definitely hard to get through, and the ending was a pretty good punch, but I absolutely loved the way that it wrapped up. I thought that R.F. Kuang did such a beautiful job with the characters from start to finish in the trilogy, and I really, really enjoyed it. It's definitely been one of my favorite fantasy series, and I also feel like it's a little bit of historical fantasy, and I found that I really, really like that genre, so I just really enjoyed this trilogy overall. Now, I did get to one of my 25 non-negotiables for the year this month, and that was The Sword of Kaigen. And I was already planning to read this month, but one of the book clubs that I'm in, Crow Club, decided that this would be their January read. So I did get to have the joy of reading that along with them and interacting with everyone in the club on Fable as I was reading it. And this book was so good. I made the mistake of reading some particular chapters while I was at work, so that will be my non-spoiler warning for you that things will happen that you will not see coming, and then you'll find yourself crying in your office. So definitely proceed with caution if you're going to read the book, but this is on Kindle Unlimited, and it was such a good read. It was so good that I immediately went and bought M.L. Wong's other book that's out. I believe it's Blood Over Brighthaven, so I'm definitely gonna go and read that this year as well. And I give that 5 stars if I didn't say so already. So after I finished Dragonfall in my vlog that I filmed, I realized that the second book, Emberclaw, is slated to come out soon, so I immediately hopped on NetGalley and went to see if it was available to request an ARC, and it just so happened that it was available, so I requested it and I was approved. So I also read Emberclaw this month, and I just have to say the series got even better with the second book. It is just a duology, so it is perfectly wrapped up in the second book, but I really enjoyed the changes in setting and the character development that we see throughout Emberclaw, and Emberclaw got a 4.5-star rating from me. So if you haven't picked up Dragonfall, I definitely encourage you to pick that up and then be on the lookout for Emberclaw to come out later this year. I also did some traveling this month, and actually to Boston. I just so happened to be wearing my sweatshirt from my trip. But while I was traveling, I kept seeing this book, Playground, on all the shelves at different bookstores that we went by. It was featured in the airport, and I was so intrigued by it. So really, without knowing much about it, I looked it up to see if the audiobook was available, and I started the audiobook, and I enjoyed this book so much. I really love the ocean first and foremost. This is related to the topic of the book, but by the end of the book I would say it's less related to the overall view of the book. It's hard to explain. It's one of those things where you kind of just have to read it. But I love the ocean so much, and some of the things that they described with the different characters that one is a scuba diver, and then you've got some folks that live on a small island that's very connected to nature and the land and the ocean. And just some of the things that they were describing made me really just yearn to be at the ocean and interacting with the sea and nature. And so that really spoke to me personally. I know that might sound kind of silly, but that's just one of those things that I've always resonated with. But I think in order to really appreciate the book, you have to read the whole thing and kind of get the reveal that happens at the end of the book, which apparently there are some things that are distinct in the actual physical text, in terms of you've got text that is in normal typecase, and then you've got text that is italicized, and that is a distinction throughout the book between those two sets of dialogue that you're being given. And unfortunately, by listening to the audiobook, I did not get any of that distinction between those two segments. So the ending surprised me a little bit, but then I had this oh moment, this big like aha. So it's definitely a book that I'm going to reread physically so that I can really appreciate that and that contradiction throughout the book. But I really enjoyed this, and I'm so glad that I just picked it up on a whim. I ended up rating this one 4.5 stars, and I definitely think if I revisit it, it might be a 5-star read, but it is really bittersweet and heartbreaking by the end of the book, but it was really beautifully crafted from start to finish. So I'm really interested in getting into this author's other works, but also revisiting this one. Another book I picked up towards the end of the month was Spark of the Everflame, which is available on Kindle Unlimited, and I read this because, go figure, it was another book club book for me. This one was for Ellen Catherine's book club, and I believe I started it Monday of that week, and our book club meeting was on Discord on Wednesday of that week, or on YouTube. It's like a live chat. But it was in the middle of my workday on Wednesday, so I needed to be finished with the book by Wednesday morning so that I could jump in the call during my lunch break. And I had a few minutes to read before the call during my lunch break, and I finished the book with 10 minutes to spare. I did end up rating this book 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. I haven't read a ton of fantasy this month, so it was kind of a breath of fresh air, and it was a super, super fast paced fantasy. I know the series does get a little bit longer as we move forward, but they are all on Kindle Unlimited, so I am planning to continue with the series, and I do want to pick up Glow of the Everflame pretty soon, so you might see that in my February wrap up, but I'm not going to make any promises. And then the last two books that I got to that were not on my physical TBR this month were both audiobooks. So I listened to Solito by Javier Zamora, and this is a memoir about his crossing from his home country into the USA, or La USA as it's referred to in the book. And I really just appreciated how raw and honest he was throughout this whole book in recounting his story. By the end of the book, you learn that there's over 7 weeks that he had no contact with his family, that they had no idea where he was, and he was so brave throughout, even though he was undertaking this as a child on his own in a group of strangers. And I just appreciated that he really didn't hold anything back from his story, and that he was so genuine with everything that he recounted. One thing I also really liked about the audiobook is that he does the narration himself, and I always appreciate, especially with this type of nonfiction that's a memoir, when the author themselves does tell the story, because I feel that it helps me to feel so much more connected to them and their story when I can hear it and really visualize it through their eyes and their words when they're telling it as if you're just sitting down with them and they're telling you the story themselves. So I really appreciated that, and I ended up giving it 5 stars. And then I finished off the month with Parasite by Mira Grant. I did get this one as an audiobook through Libby, through my local library, and I previously read Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant last year, so I knew that it was going to be scientific horror, and I discovered that I really liked that genre when I read Into the Drowning Deep in 2024, so I was pretty excited to try another one of her books this year. Overall, I really liked Parasite. It did make me very uncomfortable with the concept that was being portrayed and the descriptions of some of the things that were happening medically. Definitely gave me that like uncomfortable skin crawling feeling. However, I felt like the plot itself was pretty predictable, and it was obvious to me what the kind of big reveal was at the end of the book from very early on in the book, but I am not sure if it was just if she felt that it was necessary for the characters to take that long to come to terms with it. But I felt like that just fell a little flat for me at the end of the book. However, this is book 1 in a 3-part series, so I already have the second book on hold through Libby, and I'm hoping I get that soon. And I am interested to see where things go from here, because I do think where we left off, that the story and the plot is about to expand so much more beyond where we were at with following our main character and what was happening to her into what is probably going to become a global issue in the second book. So I'm really interested to see what happens. I did rate Parasite 3.75 stars primarily because of the predictability and because both in Parasite and Into the Drowning Deep, I felt that the ending was really lackluster. Like, the story and the plot and the characters were very good from start to finish. I mean, the scientific writing, the horror, it was all very believable. I'm able to suspend my disbelief and accept the things that are being presented in her books because she does such a great job with it. But in both books, the ending just fell really short and it resolved really quickly. So I'm hoping that this one turns out better because it is a series and we have a little more time with these characters and the issues and um, the danger that they're facing, but I was just kind of let down again by the ending. So I'm hoping that it does improve. And I do know that she has a new book coming out this year, so I'd like to think that over time that will probably improve the more and more she writes in this genre. So fingers crossed that I will like the next two books in this trilogy, but I will keep you updated on how I feel about those if I do get to them.
So, I just wanted to pop in my Storygraph wrap up spreads for the month really quickly. And first and foremost, I just really appreciate that Storygraph provides these. They are such a great tool to take a look at my reading overall for the month. But as you can see, it lists 17 books, as I mentioned, that is including Nettle and Bone since I logged that on the first day of the month. But then the rest is referencing the 16 books that I read this month. And I really like that it gives you the breakdown of the genres and whether the books were fiction or nonfiction, the typical page number, and the format that you read in. And I also like that the app gives you the typical pace and mood of the books that you've read for the month. I'm really enjoying playing with all of Storygraph's features, so I just wanted to share those with you all. And I also wanted to mention that I clearly am still pretty new to using the app, but I did read on the 18th and I logged data, but on my graph it is showing 0 pages read. So if anyone has any helpful tips for how to fix that in the future, I would really appreciate the tips. But just wanted to share these super helpful spreads with you all.
In conclusion, those are the 16 books that I read in January. I did include Parasite, which is going to actually look like it's in February on my Fable and Goodreads, etc., because I finished it February 1st, but I did listen to the bulk of it in January, including it with my January wrap up. So I technically finished 16 books in the month of January if we're going by the calendar, but I'm lumping Parasite in there because I finished it on February 1st and I did do the majority of my listening for that book in January. So, overall, I think I did a pretty good job. I'm hoping to get a 100% complete with my February TBR that I picked out in my February TBR video, but you will just have to wait till the end of the month to see if I do. So, again, thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye!